Tonight on New Hampshire Crossroads, the first of a three-part series, The Murdered Maiden Student, the story of Josie Langmaid.
Hi, I'm Fritz Weatherby, and this is New Hampshire Crossroads. So broke that autumn morning, fresh and fair, it filled with golden sheen the balmy air. A day of joy foretold the cloudless sky, and nothing told of sorrow waiting nigh. The murder took place here in Pembroke, New Hampshire in 1875, and as a matter of fact, I sit here by the grave of Josie Langmaid on the anniversary of the very day that the murder occurred, October the 4th. A gruesome crime, and as a matter of fact, I would recommend that the faint of heart or young children not watch this program. This is not the usual Crossroads fare. And although the images are not graphic, the descriptions are, and the fact that it is a true story may lend a greater impact to it. It was a crime so horrible, so sickening, that to this day, the people who live in these towns, in Suncook and in Pembroke, can relate the events that happened that night over 100 years ago, the night they discovered the body of the murdered maiden student.
Published in 1878, 3 years after the crime. The first half of this book is a summary of the murder, albeit sanitized and without the name of the killer. The second half of this book is verse, an ode written by the Reverend Mr. S.C. Keeler, minister of the local Methodist Church. 19th century writing, flowery and pretentious. But you know, the inspiration for this book was genuine. There was genuine grief here. Now let me tell you the story as simply as I can. This is Josie Langmaid. It's her high school class picture. Class of 1875, Pembroke Academy, Pembroke, New Hampshire. This is the Pembroke Academy in 1875. The building still exists. Modified now, but still a part of the academy. Our story begins October 4th, 1875. Josie was late. She had been waiting to walk to school with a friend, but the friend never showed. Waldo had gone on ahead of her. Waldo was Josie's brother. He was 16. Josie was 17. Josie waited till 8:45 and then left to walk the 2.5 miles from the Langmaid farm to school. On the way to school, Josie passed by the two Merrill farms, the D.F. Merrill farm and the T.D. Merrill farm. At the Coffrin farm, she said good morning to James Coffrin, who was driving his horse-drawn hayrack. Directly behind Mr. Coffrin came a second hayrack, pulled by 2 horses and driven by a man with the unlikely name of John Doe. He too said good morning. This is a photograph taken of the road Josie Langmaid walked on that morning, a photograph taken, in fact, that very week. About 1/4 mile from school, Josie said good morning to Brainerd Guile in front of his house. Mr. Guile noted that as he said good morning, the second bell was ringing at the Pembroke Academy. Josie was late for school. School let out at Pembroke Academy at 3:30 that afternoon. Waldo arrived home about a half an hour later. That is about 4 o'clock.
Where's Josie?
What?
Josie.
I thought she stayed home. At school they wondered where she was. Professor Walker asked me...
She wasn't at school?
Now, in 1875, about 2,500 people lived here in Pembroke. Lots of farms, some grand homes, some not so grand. The town had 3 major settlements. The center of town, where the academy stands, was called after its main street, Pembroke Street. Now, this was very common for its time. The center of Leominster, New Hampshire, is, for instance, called Leominster Street, and the center of Canaan, New Hampshire, is Canaan Street. Pembroke Street boasted about 75 houses. Here is the Suncook River, which borders the town of Pembroke on the west. Down in the southwest corner of the town, the Suncook and Merrimack rivers join, and here the village of Suncook lies, half in Pembroke and half across the Suncook River in Allenstown. Most of the area industry has been built here at the confluence of the 2 rivers, and here the largest number of people lived, over 400 families in 1875. The third section of town they called East Pembroke. In the late 19th century, about 30 families lived here. The Langmaid family lived here, in a good, stolid farmhouse that survives to this day. No telephones, of course, in 1875. But news that Josie Langmaid had not come home and had not been at school traveled fast. Neighbor ran to neighbor. Within half an hour, the entire town knew. And 100 men began a search. After dark, the search continued, lighted by oil-soaked rags and oakum mop torches. The discovery was made at 9:15 that night, 12 hours, half a day to the minute from the time that Josie had left for school. Half a mile from the school, one of the searchers, Dan'l Kopp, noticed some grass matted down in a birch grove on the north side of Academy Road. Guile Swamp, they called the area. It was owned by Brainerd Guile, whom you may remember said good morning to Josie on her way to school. Dan'l Kopp walked into the Guile Swamp. About 80 feet out in the wet moss, his torch illuminated something monstrous. It was Josie. I say it was Josie. It was, in fact, no longer Josie, and I say it was Josie, because it was so horrible, so awful, that Dan'l Kopp could not bring himself to go near. It, the corpse, lay on its back, one leg bent under the body. Slashed and bloody clothing partially covered the thing. There had been horrible mutilation, but the most horrible thing was there was no head, only a stump remained. Someone had cut the young girl's head completely off and had carried it away.
Help! Help! For God's sake, someone!
The searching party came, and Josie's father came, and her brother, Waldo. The men stood in a loose circle. No one spoke. No one comforted Jim Langmaid or Waldo. No one could. They just stood and wept. Grown men. 2 men were dispatched to Suncook to notify the police and Aaron Whittemore, the coroner, and to telegraph Concord for additional help. An inquest had begun there in the swampy wood. Assisting Coroner Whittemore were Dr. John Kimball and Dr. Butler H. Phillips, both from Pembroke. 4 laymen made up the rest of the inquest jury. After viewing the body and ascertaining that the head could not be found, Coroner Whittemore adjourned the jury. They would meet again at 8 the next morning. The men then made a stretcher of poles and blankets, and they carried the remains to a wagon on the road and began the 2-mile trek to Josie's home. 24 men walked with the wagon, lighting the way with their torches. It was now after midnight. Families came out and stood silently in front of their homes as the cortege passed. Someone went ahead to warn Josie's stepmother, Sarah, that they were coming. They carried the body here. This is the Langmaid farm. The men stopped in front of the house. They didn't know what to do. A newspaper account said that somebody in the crowd then said,
"Better go right in and end the suspense."
And so the headless body of Josie Langmaid was laid on the bed she had slept in the night before, her bed. And the men withdrew, and the family was alone in their grief. And in the great pitiful sadness of that night, the saddest of all was Josie's brother, Waldo. If only he had walked with her that morning. Sunrise Tuesday. 200 men begin combing the woods between the Langmaid home and the academy. On the road near where the body was found, they discover a 3-foot-long wooden club broken in 2 pieces. There is blood on it. Nearby, they find Josie's school books. About 11 o'clock, one of the searchers, Horace Ayer, notices some wrinkled blue oilcloth beside a pine tree out in the woods. He's about half a mile from where the body had been found. It is Josie's cape. Horace kneels and folds back the cape. The head of Josie Langmaid stares up at him. Word about the Langmaid family. You see, Josie and Waldo were only a year apart. She was born in 1858, he in 1859. That was the year that John Brown was hanged at Harper's Ferry. Before, when the family lived in Chichester, when Josie was 5 and Waldo was 4, their mother, Mary Ann, died. At that time, Jim Langmaid was off fighting the Civil War. While he was away, his 1-year-old daughter, Ella, died of diphtheria. 18 months later, his 10-month-old son, Clarence, also died, and Mary Ann was broken in health 4 months later, January 8, 1864. She, too, died. She was only 25 years old. Jim Langmaid came back from the Civil War and remarried, moved the family to the next town, Pembroke. He became a successful farmer, sold produce, meat and dairy products in the markets in Manchester and Concord. With his new wife, Sarah, Jim Langmaid had 3 more children. Grace was 5, Lizzie 3, and there was a new baby. Here's a picture of Jim in front of the house with Grace. Now, it wasn't that Sarah Langmaid wasn't a good stepmother. She was, in fact, a good wife and mother. But it was a hard life on the farm. The children had school and church, and after school, the chores, cows to milk, meals to prepare, socks to mend, wood to split, planting, weeding, haying, animals to tend. Josie and Waldo were good, hard-working kids, and of course, they shared the grief of their mother's death. They were as close as siblings get. Josie was Waldo's sister. She was also his best friend, and the person he loved most in all this world. Now, in 1875, there were no automobiles, but there was a very efficient railroad system and instant communication over telegraph lines. Within 24 hours, every newspaper on the East Coast had the story of the crime. A day after the murder, a special detective from the Boston Police Department got off the train at the Suncook station. He was there to help with the investigation. Detective Albion Dearborn had come at the request of the Pembroke selectmen. But frankly, he was not welcomed by the local police and sheriff. They didn't need any help from Boston. You can well imagine the outrage in the community.
Who or what is responsible?
Boomed an editorial in the Concord Monitor.
Is it because we're too lenient toward criminals? Or is it an outcome of the late Civil War? Or is it due to the prominence given to criminal affairs and to noted criminals by the sensational press of the country, making heroes out of criminals and giving them a notoriety deeply fascinating to a certain class of minds? How much of it, indeed, is due to the looseness which the marriage relation and family ties generally are coming to be regarded?
Yes, there was outrage, but people were also scared to death, because somewhere in this small town a monster lurked, and no one was safe. Police departments all over the East began rousting tramps, strangers passing through. In Lowell, Massachusetts, they arrested a tramp named John Mayer because he had what appeared to be dried blood on his shirt and scratches on his face. Authorities got out of him that he had boarded a train in Suncook the day Josie Langmaid had been killed. Another tramp was being held in Raymond, New Hampshire. And Charles Moore, the only black man in Suncook, was arrested on suspicion. On suspicion only because he was black. But while the rest of New Hampshire and New England was busy arresting tramps and the like, Pembroke police already had a major suspect. His name was William Drew. There are no photographs of Drew, but he was described in the newspaper as a ne'er-do-well with a bad local reputation. It was said that he made suggestive and improper remarks to young ladies once he got them alone. He was 24 years old, friendly, cheerful, handsome, boyish-looking, but William Drew was a loser in every sense of the word. He was desperately poor. He had few skills, and he could not read nor write. He had been married only 2 months. His wife, the wags in the community said, appeared quite pregnant. A story in the Concord Monitor stated that Drew was of
very loose character.
and the story went on to say
He is married to a woman also alleged to be of the same kind.
William Drew and his wife lived in a shack back in the woods about a mile from the Langmaid farm. And Drew was the first person the authorities went looking for. But William Drew got word and started walking south toward Manchester. Deputy Sheriff Clifton B. Hildreth loaded his revolver, alerted a fellow officer, and the two lawmen then started down the road toward Manchester. They soon caught sight of Drew, walking leisurely alone. Neither of the law officers were in uniform. Deputy Hildreth went ahead and came alongside the suspect. According to a contemporary article, these are the actual words that passed between the two men.
Drew, when did you see Josie Langmaid last? I mean the young lady that was killed in the woods while going to school.
A day or two ago. Terrible affair, that murder. Have they got the man?
Yes, I think so.
Do you?
Yeah.
Who is he?
Well, he's you. You are my prisoner, Drew. I arrest you on suspicion of being the murderer of that girl. Don't put your hands in your pockets or I'll shoot you dead.
Later that day, the Concord Monitor wrote,
An arrest this morning of one William Drew on suspicion of being the perpetrator of the horrible crime. Drew is described as a low, worthless fellow who lives on the Cogswell-Dudley place, a half-mile from the scene of the murder. He is 24 years old and of intemperate habits, it is said, and the suspicion points strongly to him. He is lodged in the lobby at Suncook this morning with considerable difficulty, Officer Hildreth being compelled to draw a revolver on the crowd who wanted to lynch him on the spot.
For God's sake, don't let the mob get me.
No, we'll take good care of you. Leave that to me. Gentlemen, fall back. Fall back. There must be no illegal violence here. The first man who attempts such will pay with his life.
and so William Drew was locked up in the lobby, the Suncook Town Jail. That evening, a mob gathered outside, and word in the mob was that the police now had absolute proof of Drew's guilt. That proof was to be provided by the testimony of a 20-year-old schoolteacher from Chichester, Miss Belle Lake. This from the Concord Monitor the next day. Quote, Miss Lake of Chichester taught school in Pembroke the past season and was an intimate friend of Miss Josie Langmaid. Returning to her home from an absence on Tuesday, her mother said to her, "You know Josie Langmaid, don't you?" And receiving an affirmative response, she said further, "She was murdered yesterday and shockingly mutilated." Miss Lake immediately replied, "I know who did it. It was William Drew. Josie told me that Drew had insulted her in the street, and she told Drew if he ever repeated the insults, she would tell her father." To which Drew replied, "Don't you tell him. If you do, I will murder you and cut you into inch pieces." Miss Lake was scheduled to testify in person at the inquest on Saturday. That night, the crowd outside the lobby was ugly. Lawmen were armed and on alert until dawn. Next morning, Drew was taken to the Concord jail for his own safety. Next week, the post-mortem and the funeral of Josie Langmaid, and some surprising new evidence. Now, we don't want to give all this away, but it turns out that William Drew did not do it. And so William Drew was confined to the Concord jail, charged with the murder of Josie Langmaid, and the people in Pembroke began to relax a little. The monster was, at least, now locked up, and Drew was the monster. Miss Bell Lake knew for certain that Drew had threatened Josie with murder, and Bell Lake was, after all, a schoolteacher. Her word meant something. After they put Drew in jail, the police carried his boots to the Langmaid house. Seems that when he was arrested, William Drew had been wearing a pair of number 6 ladies' boots, boots that belonged to his wife. You see, he was too poor to afford boots of his own. All he had was a pair of rubber galoshes, which he wore with heavy socks. But the galoshes were full of holes. For his Chester, Drew had borrowed his wife's shoes. Being poor in 1875 was almost a license to starve. At the same time that Drew was being arrested, the formal post-mortem was taking place at the Langmaid farm. 3 local physicians, Dr. Butler H. Phillips, Dr. George H. Larrabee, and Dr. Charles Hildreth, conducted the examination. Dr. Phillips, you may remember, had been at the scene after the discovery of the body.
The victim, Josie Langmaid, was 17 years, 10 months, and 27 days old. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, about 110 pounds, light brown hair, blue eyes. The victim's head was severed from her body between the first and second vertebrae. The cut was made with a sharp instrument, a knife, possibly a razor. The loss of blood from the body indicated the victim had been alive when the decapitation began. The victim had been raped. The body's private parts had also been cut away. This, it was ascertained, was done after death. The thumb and 3 bones of the victim's right hand were broken. This indicated that she had put her hand up to fend off a blow from a club or stick. The right ear was mangled and torn away. A 1.5-inch cut ran along the right side of the head near the top, and a 3-inch cut above the left cheek. In the middle of the right cheek was an imprint of a man's boot heel.
Which is why early the next morning the sheriff brought Robert Drew's boot to the Langmaid house to see if the heel mark fit the bruise. It did not. The case against Robert Drew was looking less sure. During the post-mortem, Dr. George Larrabee measured the boot heel mark on the cheek and made an exact tracing of it on a card. That was in case a boot might be found later. And then with surgical thread, Josie Langmaid's head was reattached to make the body presentable for the funeral the next day. And what a day it was.
Hundreds of people came in carriages and conveyances of every sort. By 2 in the afternoon, the crowd overflowed the house and spilled out into the yard.
The Pembroke Academy students came as a group, each wearing white gloves and a mourning badge. The Congregational Sunday School, where Josie was a member, attended as a group. A cold wind blew across the meadows. Dark clouds filled the sky from horizon to horizon. There was not a sound, save for a barking dog in the distance. The doors were opened and the grieving were permitted to view the body. The ladies were admitted first. Josie lay as if asleep. her hair parted and combed back in simple folds. A garland of flowers encircled her neck, covering the stitches. Most of her scars were not visible save one, the heel mark on her cheek. It was late in the afternoon when the mourners followed the hearse to the cemetery, and there, in the near dark, they lay Josie Langmaid in the ground, there beside her mother. The cold had withered all the flowers on Josie's grave. Like Josie herself, they were dead. Now, as the funeral was taking place, Suncook police arrested another man, a friend of Robert Drew, one Charles Moody, also of Suncook. Moody was charged with being an accessory to the murder. And 2 towns away in Pittsfield, a third tramp was arrested on suspicion of being the murderer. After the funeral, while the women followed the family to the cemetery, the men formed into a search party. Under the direction of Chairman of the Selectmen, Trueworthy L. Fowler, they began combing the area for any clues that might have been overlooked. Near the spot on the road where Josie was struck down, the searchers found a black comb broken into 2 pieces, a fragment of Josie's belt buckle, 2 hairpins, and a switch of braided hair that Josie had worn that day. But no other clues. And in fact, still missing were a wallet with an imitation $1 greenback, which Josie had cut from a magazine to pretend she had some money, apparently. Also missing was a ring for her finger, made out of black rubber. These items would prove to be very important before this case would come to an end. And the end seemed near at hand. It appeared to be an open and shut case. William Drew was the killer. Of that there was little doubt, and William Drew was safely behind bars. But then on Friday, October the 8th, a telegram arrived, addressed to the Suncook Selectmen. The wire came from the selectmen in St. Albans, Vermont. It concerned a man called Joseph LePage. LePage, the wire said, had raped and murdered a young schoolteacher in St. Albans the year before. The selectmen in St. Albans were sure of it. But there had not been enough evidence to bring him to trial, and LePage had skipped town. But most importantly, the St. Albans selectmen had reason to believe that Joseph LePage was now living in Suncook. There are now 6 suspects: the tramp in Lowell, the tramp in Pittsfield, William Drew, his friend, Charles Moody, the black man, Charles Moore, and now Joseph LePage. But William Drew was still the major suspect. Sheriff Hildreth and Detective Dearborn were now getting along. The two had gone to Drew's house right after his arrest, turned the place inside out looking for clues, a knife, bloody clothing. They found nothing. They questioned Drew's wife and his mother and father. Drew, they were told, had been building a stone wall with his father that morning, and in the early afternoon he had taken his mother to Dr. Kimball. His mother had injured herself with a pitchfork. Dearborn and Hildreth would check with the doctor. They would also take the testimony of Miss Bell Lake on Saturday. In the meantime, Drew would remain in the Concord jail. The day after Josie Langmaid's funeral, Conductor Davis of the Concord Railroad got off the train in Lowell, Massachusetts. He had come to identify the tramp who was held under suspicion there. The tramp turned out to be John Belledew. Belledew, the conductor said, had gotten aboard his freight train at 3:30 on Monday morning, and so could not have been in Pembroke at the time of the murder. Belledew was released. The tramp in Raymond also had an alibi and was released. And Detective William Prescott of Suncook went to Pittsfield, where he determined that the tramp delayed there also could not have done the deed. William Drew's friend, Charles Moody, had been questioned but not jailed, and the black man, Charles Moore, also had an alibi. There were now only two major suspects, William Drew and Joseph LePage. But the police were waiting to hear the testimony of Miss Belle Lake at the inquest Saturday. And Saturday, Miss Belle Lake told her story.
Just as we were going into Mr. Wilkins' picture room, Josie Langmaid looked across the street, and there was William F. Drew of Pembroke, whom I had known personally a long time. Josie began to tremble and looked pale and frightened. I asked her why she trembled. She said that on the morning she was going to school, and she had got halfway to the academy, Drew stepped in front of her and that she had put up her sunshade and hit him. I asked what he said. Josie said it was too bad to tell. She said that after she hit him, he said, "By God, I will get even with you. I will chop your damn head off."
A lot of people were moved by Miss Lake's testimony, but a lot of other people were not, and in fact, a Boston Globe reporter wrote an attack on Miss Lake, saying he felt her story was made up. Now, it turned out that her story was made up. We don't know why, but maybe there is a hint in the testimony itself.
Just as we were going into Mr. Wilkins' picture room, Josie Langmaid looked across the street, and there was William F. Drew of Pembroke, whom I had known personally a long time.
The final evidence came from Dr. J.M. Kimball, who told police that, yes, Drew had accompanied his mother on the day that he had treated her for her foot, the day that Josie Langmaid was killed. It was obvious Drew was not the killer. All that remained now was LePage. And this is Joseph LePage. On Friday afternoon, Sheriff D.L. Morgan from St. Albans, Vermont, got off the train in Suncook. He had come to tell the Pembroke Town Fathers what he knew about the murder of Marietta Ball. His story was this. Marietta N. Ball had been a schoolteacher in St. Albans. She was 24 years old, attractive, athletic, well-liked. And on a Friday evening in July of 1874, she had started walking from her house to the home of a family friend to pay a visit. She never arrived. A searching party was formed, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, Marietta Ball's body was found down in the woods there, just beyond this bridge and across this small stream. She had been raped and strangled and bludgeoned to death, and her body had been laid out rather formally, straight out with her hands beside it, her ankles crossed, and clothing spread over the body, and her outer skirt had been wrapped around her head to cover where the skull had been fractured. And there was blood on the stones, there was blood on the bridge and the road, and the area around the body was all matted. Apparently, Marietta Ball had put up quite a struggle. She had fought like a tiger. And there was this oddity. In the bushes nearby, there was a mask that looked very much like this. It was made of carpet, it covered the whole head, and it was sewn together with birch twigs. There was a path that led from the murder scene up through the woods to a section of St. Albans that's known as French Hill. 2 days after the murder of Marietta Ball, the authorities in St. Albans stormed French Hill. Suspicion zeroed in on a 38-year-old farmer, Joseph LePage, also known as Joseph LePage or Joseph Paget. LePage had a reputation. He beat his wife. He caroused. He had arrived in St. Albans the year before under suspicious circumstances. The rumor was he was running from the law in Canada. LePage had no alibi for the time of Miss Marietta Ball's murder. The most damning evidence against LePage was his face. The day after the murder of Marietta Ball, LePage's face was covered with deep scratches. He told police he'd fallen into poison ivy while picking berries, and 4 of his friends in the French community swore that they were with him picking berries at the time of the murder. And here's another piece in this bizarre history. In their anxiousness to discover the killer, the St. Albans police employed a psychic, a clairvoyant, called Sleeping Lucy, who lived in Bennington. Now, Sleeping Lucy told them a number of things. First, that the killer had lay in wait beside the road after coming through the woods to the spot so as not to be seen. Second, that the rape and murder had taken place just off the road and not where the body was found. In fact, she said the body had been dragged about 150 feet further into the woods. The murderer, she said, had indeed come from the French community, French Hill. And further, she said, the victim's underwear could be found buried under a log somewhere in the forest more than a mile from the murder scene. She said that the murder had occurred about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the killer had traveled back to the French community via a circuitous route which took him by a sawmill. 2 weeks later, LePage disappeared from St. Albans.
That was in July. The very next May, LePage, his wife, and 4 of his children moved onto the 3rd floor of the Hall Wilkins house, a tenement which was located right next door to the police department here in Suncook.
LePage immediately went to work as a wood chopper, working for Joe Daniels. Now, Joe Daniels was the head man in the Suncook French-Canadian community. He hired men to cut wood used to power the new Corliss steam engines that ran the mills in Suncook. In 1875, there was plenty of work for wood choppers. Dozens of men worked for Joe Daniels. He paid them according to the amount of wood they cut and piled. Joe Daniels was their bread and butter, and what he said went. Now, as Joseph LePage lived right next to the lobby, it was very easy for Deputy Hildreth and Boston Detective Dearborn to find him. They just had to go next door. And they did just that. On Friday night, 5 days after the murder, they escorted Joseph LePage next door to the lobby. The policeman wanted some answers. LePage was calm and seemed unconcerned.
Lundi, ce jour-là, j'étais perdu. Mais j'ai suivi le petit chemin, mais je ne pouvais pas trouver le loup. Alors je me suis assis et je mangeais mon petit dîner. J'attendais bûcher enfin, et j'étais voir. Il avait des bûcheurs là.
On Monday, that day, I got lost. I went down the path, couldn't find the lot. Then I sat down and ate my lunch. And I heard some chopping. And I go see. There are some choppers there. They built a shanty. I asked, where's Joe Daniels? I go see Joe. I ask him to measure my wood. He tells me later, he tells me he'll leave the money with my wife. I work the rest of the afternoon, then go home. Got home about dark. So that was his story. Joseph LePage had been lost in the woods the morning Josie Langmaid was murdered. Sheriff Hildreth asked him if he owned a knife, and he took from his pocket and showed them a jackknife with a 3-inch blade. The knife was not sharp. Now, to this day, no one is sure how old Joseph LePage was. He had no birth certificate. He claimed to be 38. His wife said he was 42. Age aside, there are many things they do know about him. He was 5 foot 7 inches tall, with thick, jet black hair, black eyes. He weighed 150 pounds. When questioned at the lobby, He was dressed in a dark shirt and dark brown trousers, which he wore over a pair of overalls. Even indoors at the lobby, he kept his hat on. As for his family, there were 5 children. They ranged in age from 3 to 17. 4 of the children lived in Suncook. The 17-year-old, a son, remained in St. Albans and had nothing good to say of his father. LePage's wife was described in the newspaper as being, quote, heartbroken and worn out by grief and abuse. The day after questioning LePage, police made a search of his apartment. They found a large knife on a shelf. They also found 2 straight-edge razors. They confiscated 2 pair of overalls and a dark coat. The coat had bloodstains on it. After the questioning, Joseph LePage was allowed to return home. Unlike the arrest of Robert Drew, this time the wheels of justice turned slowly. Saturday, Sunday, Monday. On Tuesday, October 12th, New Hampshire Attorney General Clark appointed Detective Moses Sargent of the Boston Police Department to head up a separate state investigation. The next evening, 1 week and 2 days after the murder, Detective Sargent, Concord City Marshal Connell, and officers Rand and Prescott of the Manchester Police drew up in a carriage in front of LePage's home. They rushed up the stairs to the 3rd floor of the tenement and surprised the suspect at his kitchen table. By 7 o'clock, LePage had been quietly arrested, handcuffed, and was on his way in the carriage to Concord Jail. The entire arrest took less than 3 minutes. Detective Hildreth and Boston Detective Dearborn were livid. They said they had intended to put LePage before the coroner's inquest that evening. They were livid, but also embarrassed. No one had been watching LePage at the time the state made the arrest. And Detective Dearborn and the local Pembroke police were not the only ones to be livid about the arrest. The French community, too, was livid. The feeling was that LePage had been arrested simply because he was French, as Charles Moore had been picked up simply because he was black. Joe Daniels himself was, in fact, to come forward and provide LePage with an alibi. LePage, he said, had been with him on the woodlot all day, the day of the crime. But it was too late. When he was arrested Wednesday evening, LePage had told the police the same story that he had told Detective Dearborn that Friday before, that is, that he had gotten lost in the woods on his way to work the morning of the murder. Joe Daniels' alibi for LePage was in conflict with the 2 statements taken from LePage himself. And so Joseph LePage was locked up in the Concord jail, and William Drew was released. No one apologized to Drew. In fact, as he was let go, he was warned to keep his nose clean and to let his experience in jail be a lesson to him. After his release, a watch was kept on him by the police to make sure he didn't leave town. At 3:45 in the afternoon, October 28, 1875, a grand jury unanimously indicted Joseph LePage for the murder, mutilation, and rape of Josie Langmaid. LePage pleaded not guilty.
Next week, the conclusion of the Josie Langmaid story. Until then, for New Hampshire Crossroads, I'm John Clayton.
headless body of Josie Langmaid has been discovered in a swampy wood in Pembroke, New Hampshire. Josie was a 17-year-old student at the Pembroke Academy. The very next day, the head is discovered. The post-mortem is held, and the head is reattached for the funeral. A young man named William Drew is arrested for the crime, and a mob tries to lynch him on the spot and is driven off by the sheriff with a revolver. And then a schoolteacher from Chichester comes forward to testify that Drew threatened Josie Langmaid with murder. She knows it for certain. But the fact is that Drew has a solid alibi for the time the murder occurred. He is not the killer. Suspicion then centers in on a 42-year-old woodchopper, Joseph LePage. Before he came to Pembroke, LePage had lived in St. Albans, Vermont. He left that community directly after a body of a schoolteacher was found in the woods there, and the authorities in St. Albans were certain that LePage had murdered the woman. But they didn't have enough evidence to bring him to trial. Page skipped town. A year later, he appeared in Suncook. Now, LePage has no alibi for the time of the murder. And as our third and final episode begins, Joseph LePage is in Concord Jail, awaiting trial for the murder of Josie Langmaid. The trial of Joseph LePage is set for the second Tuesday in January, 1876. Judge Stanley appoints Samuel B. Page, who was a Concord attorney, to defend the prisoner, and the state begins building its case. At the Concord jail, the first suspect, William Drew, had been a model prisoner. Joseph LePage was nothing but trouble. His first week in the Concord jail, he ripped a piece of iron from his bed and dug a hole in the wall of his cell. They found the iron tool secreted in his bed. A week later, they found another iron bar missing from the bed. This was found beneath the prisoner's shirt, under his armpit. It had been sharpened like a knife by rubbing it on the stone floor. So they took his bed away, and he slept on a mattress on the floor. A week later, he stuffed Excelsior from his mattress into a ceiling ventilator and tried to borrow matches from the guards. So they took his mattress away, and for the rest of his time in confinement, he slept on the floor with only blankets. Now, as the trial approached, tension between the non-French and French communities in the towns of Pembroke and Suncook became palpable. Everyone was angry. Many witnesses were now coming forward to swear they saw LePage on the morning of the murder, and many other witnesses were coming forward to say that LePage was with them at the time of the murder, and so could not have done it. On November 22nd, the Vice President of the United States, Henry Wilson, was stricken on the floor of the Senate in Washington, D.C., and died. New Hampshire had a special interest in this story, as Wilson had been born in New Hampshire, in Farmington. Next day, November 23rd, Josie's brother Waldo was sent home from Pembroke Academy because of a high temperature. At home, Waldo tried to do his chores but became disoriented. His stepmother, Sarah, put him to bed. He had, he said, been constipated for a number of days. Dr. Butler H. Phillips confirmed what the family already had guessed. Waldo had typhoid fever. Typhoid was common in 1875. It was spread in food that had come in contact with human waste. Waldo's temperature rose to 102 degrees. Red spots covered his body, pneumonia followed, and on December 15th, 10 days before Christmas, Waldo Langmaid died. He was 16 years old. They buried him here. On Monday, January 4th, 1876, at 7 minutes to 11 in the morning, Joseph LePage was escorted by 2 officers to the prisoner's dock in a makeshift courtroom at Concord City Hall.
Great God Almighty, with your infinite grace and charity, look down upon these proceedings this day and grant us the wisdom to do thy will. Amen.
Judge E.D. Rand of Merrimack County Superior Court and Chief Justice William L. Foster presided. Representing the state were Attorney General Clark, County Solicitor Flanders, and Attorney Charles B. Sanborn. Defending LePage were Attorney Samuel B. Page, assisted by Attorney William T. Norris. By 1:30, the jury had been chosen.
By the time the train arrived from Suncook, the hall was packed with people and the doors were locked by order of the court. 100 ladies were present at the time. The scene was a very affecting one when the torn and cut clothes of the murdered girl were exhibited to the court and jury and will not be forgotten by those who saw them. On Thursday, Doctors Phillips, Hildreth, and Kimball testified about the post-mortem.
Dr. Hildreth, you were there when Dr. Larrabee drew the representation of the heel mark on the victim's face?
I was.
And you had a chance to compare the representation with the actual heel of the defendant, Joseph LePage's boot?
I did.
And what did you observe?
The boot heel and the drawn representation corresponded exactly.
From the beginning, the trial was one-sided in favor of the prosecution. Number of witnesses testified that they saw Josie on her way to school that morning. 2 witnesses testified they had seen LePage himself that morning. William Cate claimed to have passed LePage as he, Cate, was driving a load of hay down Academy Road. And Hattie Galt, classmate of Josie's, claimed to have seen LePage pass the Pembroke Academy that morning about 8:45. LePage, she said, carried an axe on his shoulder. And Hiram and Harriet Toll testified that they had seen LePage on Academy Road the Saturday before the murder. Their testimony was that on that day, LePage was walking along with a club held behind his back. After LePage was arrested, Mrs. Toll had gone to the Concord jail and identified LePage as the man she and her husband had seen that Saturday. But the most damaging testimony came from a person who had never been in Pembroke. In fact, had never been in the United States before her arrival in Concord just the day before.
Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Je jure.
Please state your name.
Julienne Rousse.
Julienne Rousse, LePage's sister-in-law.
What is your relationship to the defendant?
Il y a marié ma sœur.
And when did you last see Monsieur Lepage?
4 ans, à Dizier, Marion, Canada.
You have a story to relate?
Oui. Je suis allée dans le champ pour tirer les vaches.
You see, I went to a pasture to milk cows while living in St. Beatrice, Canada. When I arrived at the pasture, the cows were not there. LePage was above, in the pasture, with a buffalo robe mask on his face.
The
defense objects. The exception is noted, Mr. Page, but I will allow the testimony.
Lepage portant un masque de bison, une chemise rouge faite à la main, mais elle était bien fanée, et les pantalons avec des lignes et avec une ceinture de cuir.
LePage wore a buffalo robe mask, a homemade red shirt. It was faded, and lined pants with a leather belt around him. He had a pine root in his hand the size of my arm, 3 feet long.
Un boulot. Il était 4, à peu près 5.
He was 4, maybe 5 rails away.
How long were the rails?
À peu près 10 pieds.
10 feet, maybe. The place was not in sight of any houses. It was 7 o'clock in the morning in June 1871.
71.
5 years ago?
Oui.
What happened then?
Il a essayé de m'attraper. J'ai couru à peu près 40 pieds.
He tried to catch me. I ran 4, maybe 5 rails when he caught hold of me. I turned around and pulled his mask off of him. I recognized him by his face.
Il m'étouffait.
He then rolled his face into my skirts. He tried to choke me and rubbed sand into my eyes and mouth. He choked me, and I gave up.
And?
Ça m'a arrangé.
He outraged me.
Did he hit you with a stick?
Non.
When did he go away?
Je ne le sais pas. J'ai perdu ma connaissance.
I don't know. I lost my senses. It was 2 hours before I could get home.
Non, il m'a pas frappé avec le bâton.
No, he did not hit me with a stick. He committed rape upon me and choked my throat with his hand, which left black marks upon me.
Il a laissé des marques noires.
It was not lost on the jury that Mademoiselle Julianne Roos's story involved a mask not unlike the mask that was found here at the scene in St. Albans, where Marietta Ball was raped and murdered.
LePage's lawyer, Samuel B. Page, vehemently objected to Mademoiselle Roos's testimony. It was wholly unproven, he said, but Judge Foster and Judge Rand allowed the testimony.
My name is Théophile Boudreau.
Now, this is very important, Mr. Bondreau. Do you swear to this court that Joseph LePage was at the Woods Shanty from 8:30 to 9:30 on the day Josie Langmaid was killed?
Well, I didn't know LePage was then, but I saw a man in the woods at that time, that day.
If you didn't know LePage at that time, then how did you know it was him?
Joe Daniel called my attention to it.
I see. Could you have been mistaken about who it was you actually saw that day?
No, it was LePage.
Have you found a verdict? We have. Who shall speak for you? The foreman. What is the verdict? Guilty of murder. In what degree? Murder of the first degree. So stands the record.
So LePage was guilty, but the fact is it would be another 2 years before justice would be done. And this is because LePage's attorney immediately appealed the case and the New Hampshire Supreme Court threw the guilty verdict out. The problem was, and no doubt you have guessed it, Mademoiselle Roos's testimony, unproven testimony, even though Judge Foster had admonished the jury.
Unless you find from other evidence entirely independent of that of Julianne Roos that the prisoner killed and murdered Josie Langmaid, you must reject her evidence altogether.
Nonetheless, the state Supreme Court ruled the testimony not admissible, and so an entire new trial had to be held. But the result of the second trial was no different from the first. LePage was again guilty. Tuesday, March 14th, 1878. 6:45 in the evening, Joseph LePage is escorted from his cell in the New Hampshire State Prison. He will spend his last night on earth in the deputy warden's room. He will not sleep at all that night. Father Barry of Concord and Father J.B. Millett of Nashua's French-speaking Catholic Church are in the room when he arrives. LePage makes his last confession.
Pardonnez-moi, mon Père, parce que j'ai péché. Il y a 3 mois depuis ma dernière confession. Je me confesse.
Before they leave at 11, the priests convince LePage that he must repeat his confession to the deputy warden. At 3 a.m., Warden Pillsbury has Sheriff Dodge roused from his sleep to come and witness the confession. This from the Concord Monitor.
The confession of Joseph LePage was made to Deputy Warden Pillsbury after his spiritual advisors left him Thursday night. It was a voluntary act on his part. In fact, he broke down and manifested as much sorrow as it was possible for him to do. He fell upon his knees before them and exclaimed in much agony, "Pardon, pardon, me bad man, me kill gal, me kill two gal, pardon, pardon."
This is the first time LePage has admitted that he killed Josie Langmaid. He also confesses to the killing of St. Albans schoolteacher Marietta Ball. And then on a map, he traces his route to the murder site the day he killed Josie Langmaid. His confession is complete, though his English is broken and there is no translator. He is anxious to be completely understood. At times, he resorts to pantomime. With few exceptions, his testimony corroborates the testimony of the prosecution. The exceptions are that he had not traveled on Academy Road that day. He had rather taken a shorter, more direct route across lots to the murder site that day. He therefore could not have been seen by Hattie Galt, the Pembroke Academy student who had testified she had seen him pass the school just before the murder. Miss Galt was either mistaken or lying. As to Mr. and Mrs. Toll, who swore they had seen him on Academy Road the Saturday before the murder, they too were mistaken. But the rest of the prosecution's testimony was right on target. LePage tells the sheriff and the warden that he had left home about 6 o'clock that morning. He'd stopped to see Tom Gardner at his home in Suncook. Gardner was the foreman of the woodcutting crew. Gardner told LePage to go to the lot and wait for him. LePage then went to the bakery. After that, started for the woodlot, but changed his mind and walked back toward town. Near the corner where the bridge and the railroad tracks come together in Suncook, he left his axe and his coat. He found a walking stick and started across the lots toward the school. He met Josie on the highway and struck her with the stick. That was the cause of the cut on her head. She tried, he said, to ward off the blows, and that caused the fracture in her right hand. He dragged her into the swamp and raped her. He thought she was dead when he mutilated the body. His testimony is that she had been dead for 12 to 15 minutes before he cut her head off. He did his work with his folding knife, the one he took from his pocket and handed to the detectives when he was arrested the first time. The stick he beat the victim with was broken after the fact. He slammed it on the ground to break it purposely. It was not broken, he said, from hitting the victim. After the horror, he carried the girl's head off into the woods. He put the head down by a tree beside Hartford Brook. There, he washed his hands, the knife, and his shirt. He dried the knife, he said, by sticking it in the ground a number of times, and then he walked on, leaving the head. LePage said he did not stomp on the girl's face when he attacked her. Rather, the heel-mark bruise on her cheek was made when he was holding the head with his foot as he cut it off with the knife. He then walked back to the outskirts of Suncook, got his axe and coat, and continued to Joe Daniels' woodlot. On the way, he hid Josie's wallet and ring. Sitting there in the warden's room, LePage indicated on the map where the ring and wallet could be found. They were later retrieved. And this was the most important information of the entire confession because it was information that could only be known by the murderer himself. It was the final proof that Joseph LePage had murdered Josie Langmaid. As to the murder of Marietta Ball in St. Albans, Vermont, LePage noted that the psychic from Bennington, Sleeping Lucy, had been exactly correct in her vision of how the crime had been committed. Her story was accurate, he said, right down to the route of escape that he had used, and even to the fact that he had hidden a bundle of the victim's clothing under a log inside of a mill. LePage confessed that he had been disturbed by the accuracy of Sleeping Lucy's vision. "6 a.m., March 15th, the Ides of March, prisoners are marched to breakfast. By 8 o'clock, they're at work in the prison's furniture factory or breaking stones in the yard. As soon as the prisoners are out of the cell block itself, workmen begin to assemble the gallows. Father Barry arrives at 7 o'clock. The French priest, Father Millet, arrives at 8:30. At 10:30, witnesses begin arriving. There is a large contingent from St. Albans. At 11 o'clock, the witnesses are taken into the corridor by the gallows. The guards throughout the prison stand at ready. Strict order is to be observed within and without the building. 11:04, the prisoner is escorted to the guardroom. Last rites are given by the French priest, Father Millet. Deputy Sheriffs Pickering and Pearson place LePage on the gallows. Sheriff Dodge reads the death warrant. The reading takes 2 minutes. And at 11:08, the drop falls and the soul of Joseph LePage is ushered into eternity. Again, the Concord Monitor.
After he fell, there was only a twitching of his legs once. He died with the remarkable firmness and coolness which has ever characterized him. Dr. Crosby, the surgeon of the prison, noted the pulse. After hanging 5 minutes, the pulse weakened, became intermittent at 7 minutes, very irregular at 8 minutes. At 13 minutes, the pulse ceased at the wrist. And at 11:27, 19 minutes after the drop fell, Dr. Crosby reported to Sheriff Dodge that Joseph LePage was dead. The body was left hanging another 10 minutes, then taken down and delivered to the custody of Undertaker Crow, who prepared it for burial.
That's the story. Justice was done. LePage, the fiend, was hanged, and no one mourned his passing, neither his wife nor his children nor his father, for that matter. His body was shipped back to Canada and buried. Within a year, Jim Langmaid had moved from Pembroke out to Granite Falls, Minnesota. Jim Langmaid lived until 1902, died in bed. Here's how he looked in 1902. Here's a photograph of Sarah, also in old age. The town of Pembroke, of course, was irrevocably changed. The shame of the crime affected everyone. There was guilt, too. Guilt that such a thing could happen here. Guilt about the lies told under oath, the false arrest. No one knew what was appropriate to do, but they did know that the crime should not be forgotten, nor should ever happen again. And so they raised a monument, this grandiose piece of granite, with its directions to the spots where the body and the head were found. Bizarre, prurient almost. This is not a remembrance of Josie Langmaid. Rather, this is a remembrance of a murder. You will not find Josie here. To find Josie, you must come here. Here there is no sensationalism, only sadness. For here is Josie's mother, Mary Ann, dead at 25, and Josie's sister, Ella, dead at age 1, and her brother Clarence, who died at 18 months. And here Josie, and here Waldo. An entire family wiped out in 18 years. And there is one other artifact for us to consider. This, a book of verse, badly written verse. And in this book you will find the heart of this little community trying to come to terms with itself, trying to justify the horror in the name of God's will and charity, trying to right itself, to get its pride back and its faith, and frankly failing. For only time would do that. And perhaps not even time.
A detailed look at a crime from another time. Until next week for New Hampshire Crossroads, I'm John Clayton.